16th of September, 1942. Iorabewa Ridge, Papua. Japanese soldiers of the South Seas Detachment stood on a narrow ridgeline 40 kilometers north of Port Moresby. At night, they could see the faint glow of electric lights from the town below. The closest enemy ground forces had ever come to Australia's major forward base in the Pacific. Behind them stretched 96 kilometers of single-file mountain track, littered with abandoned equipment and shallow graves. Ahead lay Imita Ridge and the coastal plains. Imperial headquarters in Tokyo believed the capture of Port Moresby was now inevitable. Allied commanders in Australia prepared for the worst. Yet within 10 days, this same ridge would be abandoned. Within 2 months, the elite Japanese force that had fought its way across 2,000-meter mountains would be drowning in a flooded river. Their artillery lost, their commander dead. This is the story of how terrain, disease, and logistics turned victory into defeat. 23rd of January, 1942. Rabaul, New Britain. A Japanese staff officer drew a series of red grease pencil arrows across a map of the Southwest Pacific. The arrows formed an arc from Rabaul southward through La, Salamaua, Buna, then overland to Port Moresby and beyond toward the Australian coast. The map represented Imperial General Headquarters' grand design for isolating Australia from the United States. Rabaul had fallen to Japanese forces that same day. Roughly 20,000 Japanese troops had overwhelmed about 1,400 Australian defenders in a swift amphibious assault. The harbor, airfields, and town now formed Japan's principal base for operations throughout the region. From this hub, planners envisioned a chain of forward positions stretching across the Coral Sea. The strategic concept was clear. By seizing Port Moresby, Guadalcanal, Fiji, Samoa, and New Caledonia, Japan would sever the sea communications between Australia and the United States. Australia would be isolated. Allied counteroffensives would stall for lack of bases and supply routes. The barrier would shield Rabaul and Japan's new empire in Southeast Asia. Port Moresby sat at the center of this plan. The town controlled the southern approaches to New Guinea and provided airfields within striking range of Japanese bases to the north. If Japan held Port Moresby, Allied aircraft could not threaten Rabaul. If the Allies held it, they retained a forward base for offensive operations. The initial approach was seaborne. Operation MO called for a naval invasion force to land at Port Moresby and secure the town before Allied reinforcements arrived. Japanese planners assembled troop transports, escort carriers, and cruisers for the assault. Between the 4th and 8th of May, 1942, the Battle of the Coral Sea unfolded. Japanese carriers and Allied carriers fought the first naval engagement in history where opposing ships never came within sight of each other. Aircraft from both sides struck at long range. Japan achieved tactical successes, sinking the carrier Lexington and damaging Yorktown. But the invasion convoy turned back. Port Moresby remained in Allied hands. The battle marked the first major check on Japanese expansion in the Pacific. With the naval route blocked, Japanese planners turned to an overland alternative. The 17th Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Harakichi Hyakutake, prepared forces for an advance from the northern coast of Papua across the Owen-Stanley Range. Major General Tomitaro Hori's South Seas Detachment would spearhead the operation. The route selected was the Kokoda Track, a narrow, single-file footpath that climbed from Buna and Gunna on the northern coast, crossed the Owen-Stanley Range at elevations exceeding 2,000 meters, and descended to Port Moresby on the southern side. The track had been used by miners, missionaries, and Papuan carriers, but never by a military force of any size. Japanese staff officers, including Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, assessed that a regimental-sized, battle-tested force could cross the range and capture Port Moresby within weeks. Tsuji's calculations emphasized speed and aggressive maneuver. Allied planners initially dismissed the idea. Intelligence assessments rated an overland operation as logistically improbable. The terrain was too rugged, the distances too great, and the supply requirements too demanding for a large enemy force to sustain itself. General Douglas MacArthur, commander of Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific, later stated that victory is dependent upon solution to the logistic problem. His words captured the essence of the Papuan campaign. This would be a contest of endurance, supply, and human resilience as much as tactical maneuver. The failure at Coral Sea forced Japan to commit elite ground units into terrain for which their supply system was only marginally prepared. Cosmet effect. The decision to advance overland set in motion a campaign that would test both sides beyond their planning assumptions. On the 21st of July, 1942, the first Japanese elements came ashore at Buna and Gunna. On the northern side of Papua, only about 420 Australian troops stood in their way. Within 3 days, more than 4,000 Japanese soldiers would be landed to begin the overland push toward Port Moresby. 21st of July, 1942. Port Moresby. At New Guinea Force Headquarters, a typed strength return sheet listed the forces available to oppose the Japanese landing. The document read, Maroubra Force 39th Battalion, Australian Military Forces, Papuan Infantry Battalion, total effectives approximately 420. Next to it lay decoded intelligence reports noting thousands of Japanese troops disembarking at Buna and Gunna. The Japanese order of battle was formidable. The South Seas Detachment consisted of the 144th Infantry Regiment, numbering approximately 2,700 men, and the 1st Battalion of the 55th Mountain Artillery Regiment, with about 750 personnel operating 12 75mm mountain guns. Supporting units included engineers, signals troops, anti-aircraft gunners, and medical personnel. Overall, roughly 13,500 Japanese soldiers were landed in Papua during the campaign, of which about 6,000 were committed in the forward areas along the Kokoda track at any given time. Allied forces in New Guinea fell under the command of the New Guinea Force, led by Lieutenant General Sidney Rowell. Maroubra Force, the forward element, initially centered on the 39th Battalion, a militia unit with a nominal strength of 1,000 to 1,200 men, and the Papuan Infantry Battalion. These troops were supplemented by the 21st and 25th Brigades of the 7th Division, Australian Imperial Forces, as the campaign progressed. The technology and equipment available to both sides reflected their different doctrines and industrial bases. Japanese infantry carried Type 99 and Type 38 rifles, supported by Type 92 heavy machine guns. Their mountain artillery consisted of 70 to 75mm pack guns designed for rapid disassembly and transport by mule or man. Mortars provided indirect fire support at shorter ranges. Australian soldiers were equipped with short-magazine Lee-Enfield .303 rifles, Bren light machine guns, and Vickers heavy machine guns. Mortars included 2-inch and 3-inch models. Critically, Australian forces on the Kokoda track had almost no forward artillery in the early stages of the campaign. The terrain made it nearly impossible to move field guns forward, and air support was limited by weather and distance. The contrast in training and experience was stark. The 39th Battalion was a militia unit composed largely of young conscripts with limited training and no previous combat experience. Many had enlisted only months before and had never fired their rifles under battlefield conditions. By contrast, the core Japanese battalions had participated in prior operations at Guam, Wake Island, and Rabaul. They were considered elite formations. Yet the militia would exceed expectations. Post-war, Japanese Lieutenant General Tsutomu Yoshihara wrote that Australians on Kokoda displayed tremendous ability as fighting men in the jungle. They were superb. This respect contrasted sharply with early Australian doubts about militia reliability. The mismatch in training, artillery support, and numbers shaped Allied headquarters' initial expectations. Commanders anticipated a brief delaying action followed by withdrawal. Few believed the militia could hold out long against a Japanese brigade supported by mountain guns. Yet this underestimation set the stage for later reevaluation as the militia's performance proved better than predicted. Cause and effect intersected again. The initial weakness of the Maroubra force and the apparent superiority of Japanese arms led planners to assume rapid Japanese success. Reality would prove otherwise. On paper, Hori's brigade-sized detachment with 12 mountain guns faced a single understrength militia battalion without artillery, defending a 96-kilometer single-file track over a 2,000-meter mountain range. The operational logic suggested brief resistance at best. The campaign would prove otherwise. 27th of July, 1942. Awala, northern Papua. Before dawn, a patrol from the Papuan Infantry Battalion observed movement in the tall kunai grass near the village. The patrol leader scribbled a brief report and sent a runner back to Kokoda. The note reached Maroubra Force headquarters by mid-morning. Enemy in strength advancing from Buna. The report joined a growing stack of sighting messages, all converging on Kokoda. The sequence of engagements began with skirmishes at Awala and Oivi. Australian and Papuan patrols withdrew toward Kokoda as Japanese forces advanced in company and battalion strength. Contact was intermittent but increasing. By the 26th of July, it was clear that the Japanese were moving in force along the main track. The First Battle of Kokoda unfolded between the 27th and 29th of July. Colonel William Owen commanded the defending force, which had been reduced to about 80 men, including Papuans, by the time the Japanese launched their main assault. The Kokoda Plateau and its airstrip represented the only flat ground for miles. The airstrip was tactically vital but operationally limited. The runway was short and subject to sudden weather changes. Only small aircraft could land, and only in good conditions. Resupply and reinforcement by air were restricted by these factors. The Japanese drive focused on capturing the strip to secure a forward base and deny it to Allied air operations. Hori committed several companies supported by mortars and machine guns. Australian positions on the ridge above the airfield came under heavy fire. Colonel Owen led a counterattack to regain lost ground. He was killed in action on the 29th of July. Around 40 Australians died in this phase of the fighting. The loss of a battalion commander in the first week was unusual. Official histories later noted that 3 battalion commanders were killed or captured in the first month of the Kokoda campaign, an attrition rate that reflected both the intensity of the fighting and the necessity for forward leadership in jungle terrain where visibility and communication were poor. The Japanese success at Kokoda came faster than Allied planners had predicted. Communications delays meant that headquarters in Port Moresby often worked from outdated or incomplete information. Reports arrived hours or days after events. Orders issued in Port Moresby might be irrelevant by the time they reached forward units. Despite losing the airstrip and their commander, Maroubra Force withdrew in reasonable order to Deniki, a village farther south along the track. The force retained its core strength rather than being destroyed in place. This withdrawal preserved the battalion as a fighting unit and allowed reinforcements to move forward and take up positions. The contrast between expectations and reality began to emerge. Japanese forces had advanced rapidly and captured a key objective. Yet the defending force remained intact. Australian casualties, while significant, were not catastrophic. The militia had not collapsed. The loss of Kokoda airfield compelled Australian commanders to rely more heavily on airdrops to forward positions like Myola. It also prompted a reconsideration of the scale of forces needed on the track. The initial assumption that a single militia battalion could delay the enemy long enough for reinforcements to arrive was now in doubt. Within 10 days of the first landings, Japan controlled the only airstrip on the track and had killed the defending battalion commander. Yet the defending force was still intact. Veterans from the Middle East campaigns, experienced soldiers of the 7th Division, were already en route to the same mountains. 26th of August, 1942, Isurava, Central Kokoda Track. At brigade headquarters, a hand-drawn map showed 4 company positions strung along the slopes above the track. Each position was marked with a pencil notation indicating unit strength and weapons. A signal from Lieutenant General Rowell confirmed that Brigadier Arnold Potts was to hold the enemy as far forward as possible, while additional Australian Imperial Forces units moved up from Port Moresby. By late August, General Hori had concentrated approximately 2,100 assault troops with artillery support for the main attack on Isurava. The Australian defence was built around the remnants of the 39th Battalion, elements of the 53rd Battalion, and the recently arrived 2nd/14th and 2nd/16th Battalions of the 21st Brigade. These AIF units brought combat experience from the Middle East, but they were unaccustomed to jungle warfare and the extreme terrain of the Owen Stanleys. The battle at Isurava lasted 4 days. Japanese forces employed infiltration tactics, moving through dense jungle to outflank Australian positions. Mortars and heavy machine guns fixed defenders in place while assault troops worked around the flanks. Australian units relied on small arms and limited mortars. Conventional artillery support was almost non-existent. The terrain made it impossible to bring field guns forward, and air support remained sporadic due to weather and the difficulty of identifying targets in the jungle canopy. Casualties mounted on both sides. Several hundred soldiers became casualties over the course of the engagement. Officer losses were particularly high. Company and platoon commanders led from the front in conditions where visibility rarely exceeded a few meters. This style of leadership was necessary but costly. Isarava became a costly defensive stand that forced Japanese units to expend ammunition and time. Hori's battalions were accustomed to rapid advances against disorganized opposition. At Isarava, they encountered organized resistance that slowed their tempo and inflicted losses they had not anticipated. Public and political rhetoric in Australia emphasized no withdrawal and holding at all costs. Newspapers carried headlines demanding that the army stop the Japanese advance. Politicians in Canberra pressed military commanders for results. But operational reality diverged from public expectation. Brigadier Potts faced ammunition and ration shortfalls that limited his ability to hold ground indefinitely. Resupply by airdrop was unreliable. Stocks forward of Myola were insufficient to support sustained combat. Official records show that Potts believed there were 40,000 rations stockpiled at Myola. On arrival, he found only 8,000 rations and 2 days reserve forward. This five-fold discrepancy forced an operational pause. Potts could not concentrate his forces or sustain offensive action without adequate food and ammunition. The logistical shortfall shaped his tactical decisions. The decision to withdraw from Isarava was driven by necessity, not by failure of will. The militia and AIF units had fought effectively, but they could not hold indefinitely without resupply. Withdrawal preserved the force and allowed it to take up new positions farther south. The contrast between public perception and operational reality became a recurring theme. Australians at home read about withdrawals and interpreted them as defeats. Soldiers on the ground understood that trading space for time was the only viable option when facing superior numbers and firepower at the end of a tenuous supply line. Isarava ended with Australians ordered back. But the South Seas Detachment had neither destroyed Maroubra force nor broken through to the plains. Japanese forces had burned through men, ammunition, and rations at the very moment their own supply line over the range was becoming vulnerable. 6th of September, 1942. Brigade Hill, south of Efogi. Brigadier Potts sat in a makeshift command post and read a situation report typed on thin paper. 2 battalions were listed as exhausted. A third as below-strength enemy patrols had been reported moving on both flanks. The map showed a single narrow track marked as the only line of withdrawal. Between Isarava and Brigade Hill, Australian forces conducted a series of successive withdrawals. Each position, Eora Creek, Efogi, Menari, involved hasty defensive preparations followed by Japanese attempts to outflank the defense. The pattern repeated. Australian units held a position for a day or two, inflicted casualties, then withdrew under pressure before being encircled. The Battle of Mission Ridge, also known as Brigade Hill, took place between the 6th and 9th of September. Japanese forces executed a deliberate maneuver to split the Australian brigades and threaten the track to the rear. Companies and platoons found themselves fighting in semi-isolated pockets as communication broke down. Radios failed in the wet conditions. Runners took hours to move between units through thick jungle and steep terrain. Casualties mounted. Exact figures for Brigade Hill vary in different accounts, but both sides suffered losses in the hundreds. Australian units narrowly avoided encirclement and remained a viable fighting force despite the withdrawals. The ability to maintain cohesion while retreating under pressure demonstrated a level of discipline and leadership that had not been expected from militia units weeks earlier. Public perception in Australia and Port Moresby diverged sharply from the reality on the ground. In Australia, newspapers published maps showing the sequence of withdrawals along place names that meant nothing to civilians: Isarava, Eora Creek, Efogi, Mission Ridge, Brigade Hill. To readers, it appeared as an uninterrupted retreat, which some interpreted as failure of will or poor leadership. From the brigade perspective, the reality was different. Limited artillery, shortages of food and ammunition, and mounting sickness rates forced commanders to avoid annihilation by withdrawing while maintaining contact with the enemy. Potts and his battalion commanders argued that standing and fighting to the last man would achieve nothing except the destruction of the only organized force between the Japanese and Port Moresby. Command tension developed between levels of the military hierarchy. General Douglas MacArthur and General Thomas Blamey, commander of Australian land forces, expected a firm stand. They interpreted the withdrawals as evidence of poor morale or inadequate fighting spirit. Rowell and Potts argued on the basis of logistics and combat exhaustion. The troops were willing to fight, they insisted, but they could not fight effectively without food, ammunition, and rest. Blamey later addressed returning troops at Koitaki and told them bluntly, "Some of our troops failed. You have been defeated by inferior troops in inferior numbers." This became the origin of the infamous rabbits controversy. Blamey's words stung. Many soldiers believed they had fought as hard as circumstances allowed. The accusation that they had been defeated by inferior numbers was particularly galling, given the Japanese superiority in artillery and the logistical constraints under which Australian units operated. Cause and effect intersected again. Political and public expectations for an immovable front shaped higher command decisions and led to changes in leadership. Yet the actual tactical reality was one of necessary maneuver in impossible terrain. The same militia and AIF units criticized as rabbits had forced Hori to fight repeated engagements at the cost of his own best infantry. Every kilometer pushed his supply line farther from its coastal lifeline. Mid-August, 1942, Myola, Owen Stanley Range. In a field ambulance ward constructed from canvas and tree branches, a medical officer filled out the day's admission sheet. The tally read, 52 battle casualties, 205 sick. The sick list was dominated by malaria and dysentery. Disease became the campaign's invisible front. A dysentery outbreak began near Iorabewa in mid-August and spread rapidly through the forward units. For approximately 2 months, between 30 and 80 Australian soldiers per day were evacuated sick from a field strength of just 2,000 to 3,000 men. The rate of attrition from disease exceeded the rate from combat. Overall casualty figures for the Kokoda campaign illustrate the scale of the medical crisis. Australian forces suffered approximately 625 killed, roughly 1,600 wounded, and over 4,000 evacuated sick. Non-battle casualties were 2 to 3 times battle casualties. For every soldier killed in action, 6 or 7 were removed from the line by illness. Japanese medical data are less complete, but estimates suggest that around 4,500 of the 6,000 Japanese committed in the forward areas became casualties. Up to 3/4 of the force were rendered ineffective by death, wounds, or sickness by the campaign's end. Disease played as large a role in Japanese casualties as it did in Australia. The types of disease were predictable but difficult to control. Malaria was endemic in Papua. Mosquitoes bred in standing water throughout the jungle. Australian troops had limited access to anti-malarial drugs, and supply shortages meant that preventive doses were often unavailable. Dysentery spread through contaminated water and poor field sanitation. Skin diseases, including tropical ulcers, developed from constant exposure to wet clothing and leeches. Malnutrition weakened immune systems and made soldiers more susceptible to infection. An official summary noted that, for the next 2 months from 30 to 80 men each day were evacuated sick, mostly with dysentery. The statement quantified the drain on combat strength. A battalion might begin a week with 800 effectives and end it with 600, not because of enemy action but because of disease. Commanders planning operations had to account for this steady attrition. The contrast between planners' focus and operational reality was stark. Staff officers in Port Moresby focused on artillery, small arms, and maneuver. They drew up plans based on unit strengths that assumed healthy, well-fed soldiers. In practice, many days saw more men removed from the line by illness than by Japanese fire. Battalions that appeared at full strength on paper were often at half strength in the field. Cause and effect shaped the campaign's tempo. High disease rates reduced effective strength, slowed the pace of operations, and increased demand on already overstretched supply and evacuation systems. Both sides progressively lost the ability to sustain high-intensity offensive action. Attacks became smaller and less frequent. Defensive positions had to be held with fewer men. The jungle and mountains imposed their own operational limits. Medical evacuations required carriers, either Papuan porters or improvised stretcher parties from combat units. Moving a single wounded or sick soldier from the forward area to Myola or Port Moresby might require 4 to 6 carriers and take days. This diverted manpower from combat and supply duties. By September, the jungle and mountains had removed more Australian soldiers from the line than direct combat. Yet both commands continued to press their best units into the same terrain, committing forces to a battle where climate was as lethal as any weapon. August 1942. Myola, Owen Stanley Range. A twin-engine transport aircraft, known to the troops as a biscuit bomber, flew low over the Myola drop zone. The side door slid open, and a crewman pushed bundled supplies out of the hatch. On the ground, Papuan carriers and Australian soldiers watched as some packages landed intact in the kunai grass. Others burst open on impact. A few disappeared into the forest or tumbled into ravines. A staff officer noted in pencil on his clipboard, recovery rate 50% or less. The development of Myola as a supply base was a turning point in the campaign. Discovery of the dry lake area provided a natural drop zone where supplies could be concentrated and then carried forward to units on the track. Myola 1 was established first, followed by Myola 2 as an additional supply and evacuation point. Stock and requirement figures reveal the campaign's logistical fragility. Brigadier Potts was informed that 40,000 rations had been stockpiled at Myola. On arrival, he found 8,000 rations plus 2 days reserve forward. The five-fold discrepancy forced a halt in operations. Units could not advance or even hold their positions without food and ammunition. Lieutenant General Rowell estimated that 20,000 pounds, approximately 9 tons, of supplies per day were required to support forces at WOW and along the Kokoda track. This figure allowed for no margin of error and no buildup of reserves. Available aircraft rarely met the requirement. Transport capacity fluctuated based on weather, aircraft serviceability, and enemy air activity. Limitations of air supply became evident quickly. Early airdrop techniques were primitive. Supplies were bundled in blankets or canvas and pushed out of moving aircraft at low altitude. Parachutes were in short supply and reserved for the most fragile items. Many bundles hit the ground at high speed and burst open. Food was scattered. Ammunition was damaged. Medical supplies were lost. Recovery rates varied widely. In good drops, perhaps 60 to 70% of supplies were recovered. In bad drops, the rate fell below 50%. Some packages landed in trees or ravines where they could not be reached. Others fell outside the drop zone and were never found. The inefficiency was frustrating but unavoidable given the technology and terrain. On the 17th of August, a Japanese air raid on Port Moresby destroyed or damaged multiple transport aircraft. Exact numbers vary in different accounts, but the loss sharply reduced lift capacity at a critical moment. Fewer aircraft meant fewer supplies reached forward units. The raid had an immediate operational effect. Japanese logistics faced similar constraints. Their supply line stretched 60 kilometers or more from Buna and Gunma to the forward troops. The line depended on foot transport, with Papuan carriers pressed into service under harsh conditions. Coastal barges supplemented foot transport, but they were vulnerable to Allied air attack. By late September, Japanese forward units were receiving a fraction of planned daily rations. Lieutenant Fail, aide-de-camp to Major General Allen, later recalled, "Recoveries were never 100%. Wastage was at times terrific." The statement captured the structural limits of air supply on Kokoda. Both sides envisioned using air power and carrier columns to overcome terrain. In practice, neither achieved the logistical throughput assumed in planners' tables. Cause and effect shaped every decision. Logistic shortfalls drove operational tempo, limited options for offensive action, and directly influenced the decisions at Iorabewa and Imita Ridge. By mid-September, each additional kilometer advanced by either side added to the daily tonnage that must be flown or carried by hand. The coming decisions at Iorabewa would be made less by generals' intent than by what could physically be hauled over the range. 14th of September, 1942. Imita Ridge. Australian gunners of the 14th Field Regiment aligned their 25-pounder guns at Hours Corner, the top of the road that climbed from Port Moresby into the mountains. The guns fired over their own infantry positions toward Iorabewa Ridge. Forward observers reported intermittent flashes from Japanese positions. At night, they could see the faint lights of Port Moresby visible from the enemy's side of the ridge. The Battle of Iorabewa unfolded between the 14th and 16th of September. The 25th Brigade held positions in front of Imita Ridge, but was ordered to withdraw as Japanese pressure increased. The decision to withdraw ceded the crest of Iorabewa Ridge to Hori's troops. By the 14th, Japanese advance elements were approximately 40 kilometers from Port Moresby. From the ridgeline, soldiers could see the town's lights at night. The physical approach to Port Moresby, once thought impossible, had been achieved. External developments now shaped the campaign's outcome. In August 1942, United States forces had landed on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, opening a second major front in the Pacific. Japanese forces committed to Guadalcanal suffered heavy casualties. Naval battles in the waters around the island resulted in significant shipping losses. Over 31,000 Japanese soldiers would die on Guadalcanal by the campaign's end. The demands of Guadalcanal forced a reconsideration of priorities. Imperial General Headquarters faced a choice: reinforce Papua or reinforce Guadalcanal. Resources were finite. Ships, aircraft, and troops could not be in two places at once. On or about the 17th of September, the Japanese Southern Area Army issued orders to General Hori. The first instruction was to stop attacking Port Moresby and await further instructions. The second was to withdraw to a position of his choosing in the Owen Stanley Range. The explicit phrasing stated, "Stop attacking Port Moresby. Withdrawal from present position to some point in the Owen Stanley Range." Australian commanders did not know of this order. They expected an imminent assault on Imita Ridge. Units dug in and prepared for the attack. The United States Army Air Forces in Port Moresby received instructions to prepare for possible evacuation. Plans were drawn up to deny facilities to the enemy if the town fell. In reality, the assault would never come. On the 28th of September, Brigadier Ether launched an all-out attack to recapture Iorabewa. His troops found the ridge abandoned. Japanese forces had withdrawn during the night. The discovery shocked Allied commanders. Intelligence had indicated that the enemy was preparing to attack, not retreat. The contrast between tactical success and strategic necessity defines this phase. Japanese troops had achieved the physical approach to Port Moresby once thought impossible. They had climbed 2,000-meter mountains, fought through multiple defensive positions, and reached a point where their objective was visible. Yet strategic priorities and logistical limits now prevented exploitation of that success. The need to reinforce Guadalcanal and the inability to sustain supply over the Owen Stanleys drove the halt order, not immediate battlefield defeat on the track. Hori's forces had not been destroyed. They had not suffered a decisive tactical reverse at Iorabewa. The decision to withdraw was imposed from above based on broader strategic considerations. Cause and effect played out at multiple levels. Events on Guadalcanal shaped decisions in Papua. Logistical constraints shaped strategy. The campaign's outcome hinged not on a single battle but on the cumulative effect of terrain, disease, and competing demands for scarce resources. At the very moment Japanese infantry reached their geographic high-water mark and could see their objective, Imperial headquarters had already decided that the decisive battle lay elsewhere. These same troops must now turn back. 28th of September, 1942. Hours Corner, Imita Ridge. In the 7th Division Command Post, a fresh operations order was laid over the situation map. The thick pencil line that once ran south now ran north. The order was marked simply, "Advance." The transition to the offensive began immediately. The 25th and 16th Brigades moved from Imita Ridge back through Iorabewa and over previously contested ground at Noro, Menari, and Efogi. As they advanced, they discovered abandoned Japanese positions, stores, and graves. The scale of the withdrawal became apparent. Equipment had been left behind. The wounded had been buried in shallow graves along the track. Fighting continued despite the Japanese strategic withdrawal. At Templeton's Crossing and Eora Creek, Japanese rearguards exploited defensive terrain and prepared bunkers to slow the Australian advance. Casualties rose on both sides. The battles were smaller than earlier engagements but no less intense. Japanese units fought, delaying actions to buy time for their main force to withdraw toward the coast. Allied logistics improved during this phase. The number of transport aircraft increased. Techniques for low-level dropping were refined. Myola II was developed as a major supply point, with a small airstrip that allowed light aircraft to land in good weather. The ability to land aircraft at Myola reduced reliance on airdrops and improved the efficiency of the supply system. The recapture of Kokoda on the 2nd of November marked a symbolic and practical turning point. Australian units reoccupied the plateau and airstrip. Engineers immediately began work to lengthen and improve the strip. Within days, larger aircraft were landing regularly. Supplies could be flown directly to Kokoda rather than dropped at Myola. Medical evacuation became faster and more reliable. Wounded soldiers could be flown out rather than carried for days along the track. The contrast between Japanese expectations and reality became stark. Japanese planners had anticipated a controlled withdrawal to strong coastal positions at Buna, Gunna, and Sanananda. In practice, disease, hunger, and repeated contact with advancing Australians turned the withdrawal into a costly fighting retreat. Units that had begun the campaign at full strength were now reduced to fractions of their original size. The National Museum of Australia's summary notes that by this stage, Australians had gained valuable jungle warfare skills and were better equipped and reinforced. The transition from defensive to offensive posture reflected improved training, better supply, and growing confidence. The militia and AIF units that had struggled in July and August were now veteran jungle fighters. Japanese forces, by contrast, were weakening. Rations were inadequate. Medical supplies were exhausted. Malaria and dysentery sapped strength. The daily march back toward the coast drained energy reserves. Men collapsed from exhaustion and were left behind. Graves became more frequent along the track. The attritional retreat over the mountains degraded Japanese combat effectiveness just as Australians achieved local superiority in numbers, training, and supply. These conditions would shape the outcome at Oivi and Garari. Cause and effect continued to accumulate. The Japanese decision to halt at Iorabewa and withdraw had been driven by strategic necessity. But the execution of that withdrawal, under pressure from pursuing Australian forces, imposed additional costs. Units that might have been preserved to defend coastal positions were instead worn down in repeated rearguard actions. By early November, the Kokoda track was no longer a route of Japanese advance toward Port Moresby. It was the axis of an Australian division moving north toward Oivi and Garari, where the South Seas Detachment would fight its last major battle in the mountains. 4th of November, 1942, Oivi, Northern Papua. At a forward command post, Major General George Vassie read reports from the 16th Brigade. The reports described heavy enemy artillery and machine gun fire from prepared positions. Frontal attacks had been checked with casualties. Casualty figures were penciled onto a board as they arrived. The Australian operational plan for Oivi and Garari involved a deliberate two-pronged attack. The 16th Brigade would engage Japanese positions frontally along the Kokoda-Sanananda track. The 25th Brigade would execute a wide flanking movement through Garari, aiming to envelop the Japanese positions from the east. The plan required coordination between brigades and careful timing to prevent Japanese forces from escaping the envelope. Forces on both sides were substantial. About 3,700 Australians in 2 brigades, 7 infantry battalions, were committed to the attack. Many battalions were under strength from previous combat, but morale was high. Japanese forces numbered approximately 2,800 from the 41st and 144th Infantry Regiments. Japanese positions were supported by up to 15 artillery pieces and numerous machine guns. The battle opened with frontal assaults by the 16th Brigade. Japanese defenders occupied well-prepared positions in depth. Bunkers were concealed in the jungle and mutually supported. Artillery fire was accurate and deadly. Machine guns swept likely approach routes. Initial Australian attacks were checked with heavy casualties. It became clear that frontal assault alone would not dislodge the defense. The flanking movement via Garari developed over several days. The 25th Brigade moved through difficult terrain to reach a position on the Japanese flank. Once in place, they launched attacks that threatened to cut off the Japanese line of retreat. Japanese commanders faced the prospect of encirclement. Orders were issued to withdraw before the trap closed. The fighting at Oivi and Garari was intense. Close-quarters engagements occurred as Australian troops closed with Japanese positions. Casualties mounted on both sides. Australian losses totaled approximately 121 killed and 225 wounded. Japanese losses were heavier, around 430 killed and 400 wounded. The most significant result was the loss of all 15 Japanese artillery pieces. Artillery was the backbone of Japanese firepower. The guns had been laboriously carried forward over the mountains, disassembled and carried by teams of men. Their loss represented not only a tactical defeat but also a breakdown in unit cohesion. Armies do not abandon their guns unless they are collapsing. Large stores were also captured or destroyed. Ammunition, rations, medical supplies, and equipment were left behind. The South Seas Detachment was no longer capable of sustained operations. It had been decisively defeated in an open battle. The contrast with earlier phases of the campaign was striking. In July and August, Japanese forces had consistently outflanked Australian positions. Infiltration tactics and superior numbers at the point of contact had forced repeated withdrawals. At Oivi and Garari, the roles were reversed. The now experienced Australian brigades successfully outflanked and defeated the South Seas Detachment in a deliberate set-piece battle. Australian veteran accounts and official histories identify the loss of all artillery as clear evidence of a serious defeat for Hori's force. Armies in retreat take their guns with them if at all possible. The fact that 15 guns were abandoned indicated the scale of the disaster. Cause and effect culminated at Oivi and Garari. The attritional retreat from Iorabewa had weakened Japanese units. Disease and hunger had sapped strength. Ammunition was low. Now, facing a well-supplied and confident enemy, the South Seas Detachment was defeated in battle. Survivors were forced into a hastily organized retreat toward the Kumusi River crossings. The South Seas Detachment had lost its guns and much of its cohesion. Ahead lay the flooded Kumusi River. Behind, an Australian division was closing in. For Hori's surviving troops, retreat would prove as deadly as battle. 11th of November, 1942. Wairopi, Kumusi River. Australian patrols reached the riverbank in the morning. The Kumusi was in flood, carrying logs, debris, and, at intervals, bodies. The water was brown with silt and moved at high speed. Among captured papers was a note confirming that General Hori had attempted to move downstream by raft and canoe. The Japanese withdrawal from Oivi and Garari to the Kumusi was chaotic. Remnants of the 41st and 144th Regiments moved north under pressure from pursuing Australian forces. Communication between units broke down. Parts of the 144th Regiment were not initially notified of the withdrawal order and had to fight their way out of encirclement. Cohesion disintegrated. Conditions at the Kumusi were dire. The river was up to 100 meters wide and in flood. Bridges had been destroyed or washed away. Many Japanese soldiers could not swim. Wounded and sick men were in no condition to attempt a crossing. Units improvised rafts from logs, fuel drums, and salvaged materials. The rafts were unstable and poorly constructed. General Hori attempted to travel downstream toward Jirawa by raft and canoe. The details are incomplete, but Japanese sources and Allied post-war reconstructions confirmed that he drowned on the 11th of November. The loss of the commanding general in the midst of a chaotic retreat compounded the disaster. Estimates suggest that approximately 1,200 Japanese soldiers made it across the Kumusi and later formed part of the Bunagana garrison. An unknown but significant number drowned or were cut off on the south bank. Bodies were observed in the river for days afterward. Survivors who reached the north bank were exhausted, starving, and demoralized. Allied pursuit continued. From the 16th of November, 2 brigades of the 7th Division crossed the Kumusi at Wairopi to join with United States forces for the coastal battles at Buna, Gunna, and Sanananda. The campaign was entering its final phase. The contrast between the initial Japanese objective and the end state was stark. The force that had seen the lights of Port Moresby from Iorabewa Ridge was now reduced to weakened remnants retreating to coastal enclaves. The South Seas Detachment had been one of Japan's elite formations. It had captured Guam, Wake Island, and Rabaul in rapid succession. On the Kokoda track, it had been destroyed. Campaign summaries note that the South Seas Detachment effectively ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force after the Kumusi crossing. The few hundred survivors who reached Buna and Gunna were absorbed into the garrison there, but they were no longer an effective combat unit. Cause and effect reached their conclusion. Losses at Oivi and Garari had shattered the detachment's organization. The Kumusi crossing under flood conditions finished the destruction. Japanese capacity to hold Buna and Gunna was severely degraded. The eventual Allied capture of these beachheads was made possible in part by the losses sustained at the Kumusi. The human cost was staggering. Men who had fought for months in the mountains drowned within sight of safety. Wounded men unable to cross were left behind. The suffering of those final days defies easy summary. In less than 4 months, Hori's elite detachment had moved from the brink of Port Moresby to a desperate crossing where its commander drowned and its survivors staggered into coastal fortifications already doomed by attrition and lack of supply. November 1942. Canberra, Australia. In the War Cabinet offices, a brief summary summarized the situation in Papua. Port Moresby was secure. The Kokoda track was in Allied hands. Heavy fighting continued at Buna, Gunna, and Sanananda. Casualty tables and shipping summaries were attached as annexes. The brief concluded that the strategic situation in the Southwest Pacific had shifted in favor of the Allies. The Kokoda campaign must be understood in the context of the broader Papuan and Pacific campaigns. Kokoda was one component of a wider effort that included the Battle of Milne Bay in August and September 1942, and the protracted fighting at Buna, Gunna, and Sanananda from November 1942 through January 1943. Together, these campaigns halted Japan's southern advance. Australian losses on the Kokoda track totaled approximately 625 killed, roughly 1,600 wounded, and more than 4,000 evacuated sick. More than 150 Papuan soldiers and porters were killed, either as members of the Papuan Infantry Battalion or as carriers supporting the logistics effort. The Papuan contribution to the campaign was substantial and has not always received the recognition it deserves. Japanese losses were heavier. Estimates suggest approximately 2,050 battle deaths on the track and about 4,500 total casualties, including sickness. The broader Papuan fighting, including Buna, Gunna, and Sanananda, cost more than 10,000 to 13,000 Japanese lives according to Australian and museum estimates. The strategic consequences of the campaign were significant. Port Moresby remained in Allied hands, securing the sea and air link between the United States and Australia. Airfields in Port Moresby and later on the Papuan coast formed part of an expanding offensive network aimed at neutralizing Rabaul and advancing through New Guinea toward the Philippines. The contrast between Japanese plans and Allied reality was complete. Japan had sought a chain of forward air bases to shield Rabaul and isolate Australia. By early 1943, Allied bases around Papua instead threatened Rabaul. The strategic balance had shifted. The National Museum of Australia describes Kokoda as a crucial point in stopping the Japanese advance across the Pacific and towards Australia. This assessment reflects broad scholarly consensus. While Kokoda did not single-handedly save Australia from invasion, It decisively prevented Port Moresby's capture, protected Allied lines of communication, and marked the transition from defensive to offensive operations for Australian forces in the Pacific. Cause and effect accumulated across multiple levels. The defense and then recapture of the Kokoda track directly supported the subsequent coastal battles and set conditions for Allied offensives farther north. The campaign demonstrated that Japanese forces could be stopped and defeated, even in terrain that heavily favored the defense. It provided operational lessons that shaped later Allied operations in New Guinea and the islands. The numbers show a local campaign with global effects. A single narrow track across Papua helped determine the shape of air and sea lines that would carry Allied forces back toward the Philippines and beyond. Post-war, location unspecified. On a researcher's desk lay a post-war interview with Japanese Lieutenant General Tsutomu Yoshihara, Australian official histories, and modern campaign studies. All quoted the same engagements but sometimes offered different interpretations. Core statistics must be reviewed to understand the campaign accurately. Approximately 13,500 Japanese troops were landed in Papua during the campaign. About 30,000 Allied troops were in New Guinea overall. However, typically only about one brigade, roughly 3,500 men, was actually engaged on the track at any one time. The popular image of massive Australian armies facing down a small Japanese force is not supported by the tactical level numbers. Disease casualties for Australians exceeded battle casualties by 2 to 3 to 1. This ratio held throughout the campaign. For every soldier killed in action, 2 or 3 were evacuated sick. Japanese medical casualties followed a similar pattern, though data are less complete. The jungle and mountains killed more men than bullets. Research by historians such as Peter Williams has challenged some popular assumptions. Williams suggests that Australians often outnumbered Japanese tactically in later phases of the campaign, contrary to popular memory of constant numerical inferiority. Evidence indicates that Japanese medical casualties were relatively limited early in the campaign, becoming catastrophic only as supply collapsed in September and October. Documented perspectives from both sides add nuance to the historical record. Lieutenant General Yoshihara's remark that Australian jungle fighting ability was superb reflects a respect not always present in wartime propaganda. Australian official histories recognize Japanese tactical skill and endurance despite ultimate defeat. Both sides fought hard in appalling conditions. The contrast between popular memory and documentary record is striking. Surveys conducted decades after the war showed that around 3/4 of Australians agreed that Kokoda had saved Australia from invasion. This perception is stronger than the documentary evidence supports. Japan did not have the shipping, logistics, or strategic intent to invade and occupy the Australian continent. The objective was to capture Port Moresby, not Sydney or Melbourne. Historians now frame Kokoda more precisely. The campaign prevented Port Moresby's capture and maintained Allied communications. It marked the limit of Japanese expansion in the Southwest Pacific. It demonstrated that Japanese forces could be stopped and defeated. These outcomes were strategically significant without requiring the claim that Australia faced imminent invasion. The final judgment rests on a simple truth. Kokoda was a campaign where logistics, terrain, and disease played at least as large a role as maneuver. Adaptation in training, supply, and command allowed a relatively small Allied force to stop and reverse an elite opponent. The numbers confirm that jungle, mountains, and disease inflicted more casualties than any single engagement. But they also show that a limited force, sustained at the edge of its logistical capacity, prevented Port Moresby from falling and helped shift the Pacific War from defense to advance. The Kokoda track remains a symbol of Australian military achievement. The sacrifices of those who fought there, Australian, Papuan, and Japanese, deserve respect and remembrance. The campaign's place in history is secure, based not on myth but on documented fact. If you value detailed, fact-based military history grounded in archival evidence and hard numbers, consider supporting the channel. What is your perspective on this part of history? Share your thoughts in the comments, because every memory and reflection helps keep the past alive.